Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. La'asok b'divrei Torah, la'asok b'divrei Torah. La'asok b'divrei Torah, la'asok b'divrei Torah. Good evening. So, as always, we begin our evening by giving a little tzedakah into our charity box. You should be emptying it out at some point to make sure that you're giving it to someone on the street or a cause or whatever you want, not a temple, but giving it to some sort of cause. So the angel of charity blesses us, and tonight we continue studying. So a couple of announcements. A week from Wednesday, that's Wednesday, January 27th, at 7:30 p.m., we will be having a virtual Tu B'Shvat Seder. Tu B'Shvat, the New Year of the Trees, and in Masechta Rosh Hashanah, and the tractate on Rosh Hashanah in the Talmud, it actually says there are 4 New Years, and it places in the same sentence as Rosh Hashanah, it places Tu B'Shvat. It is a very special holiday. In our Kabbalistic tradition, we do a Seder. There are 4 cups of wine, there are different kinds of fruits and nuts, and it's a very beautiful, beautiful experience. We're going to try and do it virtually by doing it Zoom because I don't want to have 50 people at the house or at the synagogue. So we're going to try and do it on Zoom, and that'll go out in emails to set that up as well. And we have Shabbat services this coming Friday evening at 7:30 in our sanctuary, again, also streamed live on both YouTube and Facebook. So let's get right into some study this evening. If we think about where we ended, we finished with Hasidism. Excuse me. Thank you. And meditation and all of that, and the different movements and Reformation. And there's some other things that happen in Judaism as we start getting into the 18th, 19th, 20th century. So one of the movements that comes around is something called Mussar. Mussar is really Jewish psychoethics. It's a way of interacting with the world so that you're really doing deep therapy and becoming more conscious, becoming more aware, becoming more respectful, becoming what we call lifnei mishor sadin, before the line of the law, really becoming a mensch and acting and how we act. This movement has a certain level of popularity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it never really catches on like Hasidism because it's very, very challenging. It's very, very involved, deep, deep self-work. So let's talk a little bit about the history of Mussar. Mussar goes back, it's talked about in Talmud, it comes from Proverbs, this idea of Jewish ethical behavior. And again, Judaism is about behavior more than it is about belief. It's more about action. But we have a man named Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, we call him. He lives from 1706 to 1746. And he writes 3 books that are all pretty amazing. They're all amazing. But he really does a couple of books that are phenomenal. So the first one that he writes, they're not in order, but of these 3 books, one is called The Knowing Heart. This is an amazing book. It's a dialogue between the head and the heart, or between the mind and the spirit. And it's really a wonderful, wonderful piece of work. That light is so bright. Elena, would you please pass me those glasses so I can read some of this? It's this wonderful dialogue going back and forth between the mind and the spirit, between the heart and the head. Thank you so much. With the bright light and the small print, I need glasses. So here's just an example. I'm just going to randomly turn to some quotes. And this is a book you can study your entire life. So, here's a comment that any imperfection is a removal and a barrier that comes between ourselves and the Holy One, blessed be He, which keeps us from uniting with Him as we could without it. And this is the defect we must strive to rid ourselves of in order to attain the aforementioned perfection. The idea being that perfection, wholeness, is really when we are conscious of being in devakut and cleaving in our awareness in our intimate relationship with God. And so this work really talks about the head versus the mind. Okay, an amazing piece of work. This one over here is called Derech Hashem. This is called The Way of God. Another piece by Luzzatto, all in the 18th century. And this kind of deals a little bit more with how we study Torah. It's more specific to Torah, and how we study it and how we use it to cure our behavioral imperfections, our character traits. Now, I'm going to give you an example. So being stubborn is not such a good thing. Being persistent is. Now, it's the same quality, but it's a different way of interacting with it. So we can take that quality where we're stubborn, change it so we're not stubborn, but we're pliable and yet still persistent in our growth and in who we are. Just to give you an idea of just a random quote from here. Again, I'm just randomly turning to some pages. God's wisdom arranged the transcendental forces, the roots of all that was created, and set them in an order and system in which it would be possible that there should pertain to them either rectification or spiritual damage. They therefore have states that are good and otherwise. The idea being that God creates the world, good and evil, but they're rooted in a good and evil in the spiritual realm. And so when we change something physically, it changes something spiritually, which changes something physically again. Again, this is a book like Knowing Heart that is very much about how to act, again, based on Torah. This book, and here's a small copy of just the text itself. This is Mesilas Yesharim. This is a larger copy. There are volumes and volumes with commentaries on this. This is a much deeper piece. This is considered one of the classic books. It's called The Pathway of the Just, is what it translates to. And this, again, is all about how, if you go through this work and you do this very deeply, using Torah as a guideline, and Talmud as well, ultimately, that it will change how you are and who you are. So this goes into man's duty to the world, man's duty to himself, man's duty to others. It's all about becoming more honest, more whole. Some of the titles of the chapters: the virtue of vigilance, the elements of vigilance and acquiring vigilance, the virtue of holiness, acquiring purity, the elements of abstinence, acquiring cleanliness, all these different types of of qualities, the virtue of humility and acquiring humility. And it's just this amazing work. People will spend years and years, especially in the Orthodox world, studying just this one book and its commentaries. So what happens is that the Ramchal writes these works in the 18th century. And they're very tough works. I mean, they're very, very hard in terms of how you choose to live and what you're going to do, how you're going to interact with the world. I like to tell the story. I may have told it in an earlier class. I don't remember. But the idea is to become a mensch, to be lifnei mishor sadin, being before the line of the law. You can go right up to the line that you're allowed to do and still be a jerk. So this is the idea of being a mensch. The example I like to give is from my friend and teacher, Rabbi Elijah Shochet. Rabbi Shochet tells the story, I believe it was with his grandfather. They're walking in Chicago. He's a small child. It was either his father or his grandfather, and his father slows him down. When they get home, he says, Eli, do you know why I slowed you down? It's because in front of us was an old man, and he was walking very slowly. We didn't need to walk past him and make him feel old and tired. That's the essence of Mussar. The idea that you should, pray as passionately as you can. You should jump up and down, but more important than that is to make sure you don't land on your neighbor's foot. It's all about your actions and how we really work this. So this comes from this root, this workings of the Ramchal. And then we have this man named Rabbi Israel Salanter. He lives 1810 to 1883. This is a fabulous book. It's very difficult to get, but this is a really wonderful book about him. Israel Salanter, Text, Structure, and Idea. So it's an old book. It's hard to get, but there are a lot of pieces written about Rabbi Salanter and his teachings. And he had a lot of beautiful, beautiful quotes, a lot of stories, a lot of wonderful things. Again, I don't remember if I've relayed this story in this class or not, but there's a beautiful story of how he's on a train and he's going to go to a village to speak. And while he's there, he's on the train. This man says to him, they introduce each other. Salanter doesn't say his name, but the rabbi says to the man, why are you going to this village? And he says, well, I'm going to go see the great Rabbi Israel Salanter. And Salanter says, he's not that great. The man gets up and hits him. Don't talk about the rabbi that way. Well, they get to the village. And all of a sudden the man realizes that what he did is he hit Salanter, he hit this rabbi. And he goes to the rabbi to beg his apology. And Salanter says, no, thank you. Thank you for reminding me that false humility is also a sin. Salanter had a wonderful saying that it is easier to go through the entire Talmud page by page than it is to change one character trait. And that's really the essence of what Mussar is to take a character trait we have and to perfect it, to make it holy, to make it awesome, filled with awe. And so Salanter starts this process, becomes a little bit more popular, and he starts having his students and other people having what's called a Mussar shmooze, where you would sit across the table or next to someone and work really on trying to heal or fix a character trait. And it can get pretty passionate and it can get pretty loud. But the idea is not to just say it, but to base what your advice is to your partner, to base it on Torah or Talmud, to know the Torah and the Talmud well enough to be able to give quotes and to say, this is why you need to do this. Maybe it's a quote from Proverbs, whatever it may be. Another great teacher was called the Sfas Emes, Rabbi Yehuda Alter, from 1847 to 1905. And the Sfas Emes did commentary on everything. This is a beautiful book if you want to get introduced to the Sfas Emes. This is a really beautiful book called Emes V'Emunah, Truth and Faith. And it's really about his teachings and how to study his teachings. A wonderful book as an introduction to Mussar. And he starts again doing this Mussar shmooze, doing this idea of how we behave, that our behavior really needs to change. In the 1970s, in some of the Orthodox world, especially on the East Coast, there was a resurgence of Mussar. But again, it didn't really catch on that well because it's hard work. You got to really look at yourself. And then again, it started catching on again, I want to say 10, 15 years ago. In some communities, a lot of temples will teach it. There have been a lot of wonderful commentaries written for Mussar. This is a wonderful one by Rabbi Arthur Green called The Language of Truth, which is about the Sfas Emes. And you can see that fabulous, fabulous book to study and to understand the Torah commentary of the Sfas Emes, because he looks at the Torah in terms of how we need to behave. Another wonderful book, and this is a great way to begin as well. This is called Living Mussar Every Day, and it's by Rabbi Zvi Miller. And the idea is that every day you're doing a little bit more, and it's literally day by day. It gives you thoughts, it gives you biblical quotes, and it gives you thoughts to study and to discuss and to learn with each other. A wonderful, wonderful book if you want to begin to learn a little bit about Mussar and how to live it. If you want to just understand Mussar, there was a great book by Noah Ben Shea called Jacob the Baker, Gentle Wisdom for a Complicated World, or Simple Wisdom for a Complicated World. Fabulous book. And that's an expression of Mussar without teaching it. It's a series of stories. It's based on the idea that this village has a baker named Jacob. And Jacob, every morning as the oven's heating up, he writes down on pieces of paper the thoughts that come to him from God and his meditations. And one day, some of the pieces of paper fall into some rules. And the people who buy the rolls say, oh my God, we got a tzaddik, we got this wise, righteous man in our community. And so they come to him for more wisdom. And the book is anything from quarter-page to three-page parables, where they're asking him questions and him giving insight. And the insights are really very, very Mussar-like. If you want to explore Mussar, and it's so powerful to explore, I'm going to give you an exercise that we would normally do at this point if we had a class in person. It is a really very, very valuable exercise. It can be painful, but it's very valuable. Pair up with somebody. Now, this is easier if it's someone you don't know very well, but it's someone who's also committed to their own self-development, their own personal spiritual growth. And each of you take a piece of paper and write down 5 qualities, 5 habits that you want to change. 5 things you do that you really want to change. Each of you do this. And then switch papers. And the goal of, if I'm person A, when I'm talking to person B, I'm looking at his list, and let's say again that he says he's stubborn, is that I want to beat him up, get to the root of why he's stubborn, and change that stubbornness to persistence. With no holds barred, with no gentleness, really trying to cut to the root of the matter quickly, easily. The idea of Mussar is you're taking 20 years of therapy and can instead doing it in just a couple hours. Very, very powerful movement. Again, it didn't catch on that much. We don't hear about it like we hear about the Hasidic Jews, but it's really, really wonderful. And there are a lot of people teaching it. And again, this is a great way if you want to experience without reading the original texts or the commentaries. If you want to experience, this is a fabulous, fabulous book, Living Mussar. Fabulous book to take out, to go purchase, and every day go through it and read what it has to say for that day. It's a wonderful, wonderful way of living. And Mussar really is important. Unfortunately, and I think this is reflective of the world we live in, not just Judaism, but unfortunately, often people think that if they pray hard, if they know how to daven, if they know all the prayers in Hebrew, if they know the theology, or if they know the textual quotes, that's what Judaism is about. And Mussar, again, coming from Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, that's not what Judaism is about. It's Hasidism would say, it's not what you know, it's how you feel. Your closeness with God, it's emotional. Mussar would say it's not what you know, it's how you act. And so it really is a way of changing how we interact with each other. Again, never really caught on, but it is really something worth exploring if you're someone who's into personal, psycho-emotional, spiritual development. And I really want to recommend it because it's very, very powerful. All right, so let's talk about what else happens in the world in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. Judaism is always reflective of, in many ways, of what's going on a world gestalt and a worldview. In 1776, we have a monumental thing that happens. A colony creates its own nation. And that starts a process for the next 150, 200 years of nationalities who are not necessarily their own nation wanting to become their own nation. They want to have their own homeland. They want to have their own world, their own nation, their own flag, their own national anthem, etc., etc. And it becomes that way for the Jews too. And our homeland is obviously Israel. Now, at the time, as we get into the 19th century, Israel is a part of the Ottoman Empire, and it goes ultimately between the Ottomans and the British in the 19th and 20th centuries. But it is a state. It is a state, a nation called Palestine. It's not related to the Philistines at all, to the Philistines of the Bible. But it is this area, and that's our traditional homeland, going back all the way to our father Abraham. And it's very important that we realize that the Jews of that time are experiencing all sorts of things over the world. They experience prejudice, especially in Russia and in Eastern Europe. They're experiencing freedom in America and to an extent in England. In England, often they're becoming, they're starting to have a little power maybe, or they might be landholders even. And each country has its own way the Jews are living, but they all realize the spiritual homeland is what we call Yisrael, that land that is promised to us in the Torah and that goes back to Abraham. Now, the people who are living there are not called Palestinians, they're called Arabs. There is no historical Palestine. It just doesn't exist. Despite what some people will try and tell you that are in different media or anything else, there is no historical Palestine. There's an Israel, historical Israel. And we have different leaders who want to try and start getting back to the nation, to the land that they came from. And one of those men is a man named Theodor Herzl. Herzl lives from 1860 to 1904. In 1895, he writes a book called Der Judenstaat, The State of the Jews, in which he says that the Jews, they too need to have their own nation, their own land, their own country, so they know they'll always be safe. He's called the founder of modern Zionism, Zion being the idea of going back to Zion, to Jerusalem, to Israel. And he forms the first Zionist Congress in 1897. He is the president of it. And he really starts working. He's from Austria, I believe, and he still lives in Austria a long time. And he really starts working to try and coalesce Jews from all over and get them to commit to creating a Jewish homeland and working towards a Jewish homeland and whatever needs to be done for that. He is this great leader, but shortly after he dies, there's a man named Chaim Weizmann who becomes the first president of Israel, actually. And Weizmann is very close with Lord Rothschild. And they convince Lord Balfour, who is the Foreign Affairs Secretary for the British government, to write in 1917, remember this is right the eve of World War I, to write what is called the Balfour Declaration. And maybe I should read the declaration for you. That might be a worthwhile thing. This Balfour Declaration changes modern political history in terms of a state of Israel. So this is actually what it says. And it is from, let's try that again. It is from Arthur Balfour, it's 1917. And this is literally what it says. It is from the November 2nd on 1917 from the Foreign Office. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Basically, it is England saying, if Palestine becomes a British protectorate again, we will view favorably the creation of a Jewish state there. And that then gets expanded and expanded. There are a number of leaders in this fight to try and create Israel. Some people that you may know their names: Chaim Weizmann, who I just spoke of, David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion, who lives from 1886 to 1973, becomes the first prime minister of Israel. Israel is a coalition government, kind of like a British government. Golda Meir, 1898 to 1978. Golda Meir is twice the two different times she is the prime minister of Israel. First female leader of a nation in the world. Golda Meir, who in the 30s was a very big fundraiser. She was a young woman in the 20s and 30s, and she was a big fundraiser. She would travel around America, travel around the world, trying to raise funds. Because what the Zionists did is they realized that, okay, there's here in America and England to an extent, France to an extent, there are Jews who may have some money, and in Russia, we got all these Jews who are being killed in pogroms. So we're going to take those Jews from Russia, and we're going to pay for them to come to Palestine to create a beautiful land. Also, a man named Vladimir Jabotinsky from Russia, and he predicts, maybe my favorite early Zionist actually, because he very openly and honestly predicts that this is going to cause problems down the road. So let's kind of backtrack and look a little bit what the world history was. We've got some people living in Palestine. It's called Palestine at that time. We still call it Zion or Israel. And they've got this desert land or swamp land, or just horrible place, but it's been in their family for a couple generations. It's absolutely worthless. And in comes the Zionist who says, you know what, I'm going to pay you for your land. These aren't the prices, but for your land, it's worth $1 an acre. I'm going to pay you $10 an acre. Well, the man who owns it is very happy, and he sells the land. And then the Zionist who comes helps create and change that land from a desert or a swampland into a paradise through hard work, through love, through faith. You know, they say if you live in Israel, you have to believe in miracles. And they create that this farm, which was valueless, becomes very valuable and has fruit trees. That was a big industry in early Israel. And often they're living, these groups of Jews are living in a commune called a kibbutz, where they are, you know, all sharing the work and all doing their own things. You know, this person is the school teacher, this person is whatever else, and they all reap the benefits. And they start to build this paradise. Now, at the same time, let's backtrack a little bit. Let's say that it's 1930 and a guy comes and overpays for the land, and that Arab is very happy to get rid of it. But 2 generations later, by the time we get to the 70s, the grandsons of Mr. Mahmoud, who owned the land that was sold, that money he was paid is no longer there. And the land that had been in their family for a few generations is now paradise. And they're saying, oh, you stole the land from us. No one stole anything. That's just a fallacy. No one stole anything. There is no traditional Palestine. And that's really important to understand. Palestine is created when Israel is created, and they split the United splits the Palestine and Israel. Palestinians, quote unquote, are really Jordanians, people from the Kingdom of Jordan. So this is what goes on in this country. Now, there's a challenge. On the one hand, these early Zionists, some of them are really observant Jews. Some of them are really secular Jews who are doing it on a political level. So you've got 2 kinds of Zionists, right? You've got the Zionist who is committed to being there because this is the ancestral home of the Jewish people. This is where God wants us to be. It's where God promised we would be. And then you got the guy over here who's saying, yeah, that may all well be true, but this is a national homeland and we want our homeland like every other group has their homeland. We want our own nation. That's a clashing of values. It's a clashing of beliefs and of actions. And the man who, in my opinion, may be the most important man in terms of the early formation of Palestine, Israel, is a man that is not talked about often enough. His name is Rabbi Avraham Isaac Kook. Rav Kook, who lives from 1865 to 1935. He's the first chief rabbi of Palestine. It's a protectorate. A great mystic, a great, great teacher. You can, a number of books that are out by Rav Kook. And he has, because of his knowledge, his wisdom, his understanding, his personal power, he does something very powerful that allows Israel to be created. He goes to the secular Zionists and he says, look, you are the body of the people of Israel. But those Orthodox over there who are here because they want to pray and they want to daven and they want to be in an ancestral home that's committed to us and promised to us by God and Torah, they're the spirit. And a body without a spirit is nothing. So you need to respect them. You need to treasure them. You need to honor their beliefs, their practices. And then at the same time, he goes to the Orthodox, the observant Jews, and he says, look, you are the spirit. You understand why we need to be here as opposed to be in Madagascar, which was another place, by the way, proposed to have a Jewish homeland. You know this is our ancestral home, the land of King David, the land we were brought to by God. But those guys work in the field, those Zionists over there that are socialist, secular, whatever it may be, they're your body. And all the spirit in the world isn't going to work in this world of Asiyah, this world of physicality, without their help. And Kook, through his writings and his teachings and his experiences and his dialogues and his amazing, amazing wisdom and power, he brings these 2 diametrically opposed types of individuals who are both under the umbrella of Zionism, and he brings them, instead of clashing, he brings them to respect and togetherness. So Kook really is underappreciated in my opinion. I wish we had someone like Rav Kook right now, and to bring Jews together, because we certainly need that. So the early Zionism comes from both the spiritual side and the physical side, the nationalistic side. And then after World War II, partially because of guilt, quite honestly, in 1948, the United Nations votes to accept Israel as its own nation. And immediately, I think it's 22 Arab nations attack it. There has never been a war in Israel that Israel has started. That is a hardcore reality. There has never been a war that Israel has initiated. Despite what you hear more and more in the media. But that is the hardcore reality. And Israel becomes a holy nation, which has survived war after war, thank God. Attack after attack, thank God. Um, and it's important to understand when you look at Zionism. We're going to deal more with modern Israel next week, but it's important to understand Golda Meir had a very true statement. She had many true statements. One of her statements was, "We will have peace when the Arabs love their children more than they hate us." But her other great statement was, one of her other great statements was that if the Arabs put down their weapons today, we would have peace forever tomorrow. If the Jews, God forbid, put down their weapons, the Arab would attack, and we would have no Israel tomorrow. God forbid. People have become now for decades inbred with a true hatred of Israel. It's a byproduct of anti-Semitism. It's a byproduct of a lot of things, but a true hatred. And for many years, up until roughly the early 70s, the world didn't want to express anti-Israel sentiment because it's one little country against all the rest of the world. But as we get farther and farther away from the Holocaust, people let their feelings out, and you have comments from people like Tlaib and Omar, and all sorts of comments that are just point blank lies and fallacies. So Israel is formed as an ethical nation. The army is not called the army, it's the Israeli Defense Force. It is only there to defend. And our history with it goes back for millennia, not just decades or centuries, but for literally thousands of years. There's an old story that is not true, but there's a story that the Israeli prime minister got up, or an Israeli ambassador got up to speak at the United Nations. And he said, back in the time of Moses was not allowed to go into Israel, but Joshua did. And Joshua was there, and he was bathing in Israel in one of the streams. And while he was bathing and enjoying, suddenly an Arab came and stole his clothing. And immediately one of the Arab ambassadors jumps up and says, "That's not true. We were not even in that region at that time." And the Israeli ambassador says, "Thank you for confirming that. Now I will go on with my speech." Our people have thousands of years of history in that nation. We are tied to that land. The land itself sings to us. As my friend Rabbi Shlomo Schwartz, of blessed memory, used to say, every Jew has one homeland. It's Israel. That is our homeland. We are in the diaspora. We are not in Israel. But if we do not support Israel, no one will. And it is a homeland for every Jew. It's so important that what these men and women set up retains its ethics and retains its identity in so many ways. So again, as we start getting into the 18th, 19th, 20th century, especially 19th, 20th century, we start getting Mussar based on Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal. We get these different concepts of psychoethical behavior, and at the same time, we start having this movement to have our national homeland through Herzl and through the modern Zionists. So I think that's a good place to end it for tonight. I think that's a simple thing. I really want to encourage everyone, though. Pick up a copy of Ramchal. I think the easiest book to start enjoying and affecting you is this book, The Knowing Heart. If you want to pick up an original text. If you want to just really understand Mussar, this is an amazing, amazing book. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Living Mussar every day. And make it a point every day to work on healing that one character trait, that one flaw that you really, really want to work with. You will find it incredibly valuable. You will find it changes your life. In the book of Job, it says water wears away stone. And you will see that a little bit of work on our own psyche, on our own character traits, on our own patterns changes everything in our lives in a good way. So as always, thank you for being good to me, letting me speak with you. And I encourage you to explore Mussar. And we will talk next week more about some Zionism, but we're really going to talk about the Shoah, the Holocaust, and what comes after that and how we see that. So I hope to see you Friday at Shabbat services, either in person or our sanctuary. We are socially distant, but we do have live services at 7:30 or online. And again, Wednesday the 27th, save the date. If you're not on our email list, please go to nersimcha.org or send an email to events@nersimcha.org, nersimcha.org, and sign up for our emails so that you will get a Zoom link so you can participate in Tu B'Shvat. Again, thank you for all of this, and I look forward to seeing you later in the week. Shalom.